In 2025, the United States collected $288 billion in tariff revenue. That is nearly triple the amount collected just 1 year before. The average American household is now paying over $1,300 more per year because of it, and yet this is only the beginning. Because right now, the most powerful court in the United States is about to decide whether or not the president even had the legal authority to impose these tariffs in the first place. If the Supreme Court rules against him, nearly 2,000 lawsuits are already waiting to demand refunds. If it rules in his favor, the global trading system as the world has known it for 80 years will be rewritten by a single signature. This is not just about tariffs. This is about who controls the economic destiny of 330 million Americans. And no one is talking about the real endgame. The story starts not in Washington, but in a legal doctrine most people have never heard of. It is called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. This law was originally designed in 1977 to give the president emergency economic powers during genuine national crises. It was used to freeze foreign assets and block transactions with hostile regimes. But in 2025, the administration did something unprecedented. It used IEEPA not to sanction a foreign adversary, but to impose massive tariffs on virtually every country on Earth. The justification was cross-border security concerns and trade imbalances with Canada, Mexico, and China. But the tariffs quickly expanded far beyond those three countries. By April 2025, the overall average effective tariff rate on all imports into the United States jumped from 2.5% to an estimated 27%. That is the highest level in over a century. To put that into perspective, the last time American tariffs were this high, the Great Depression was just beginning. Now here is where this gets far more complicated than most people realize. These tariffs were not passed through Congress. They were not debated on the Senate floor. They were not subject to any legislative vote. They were imposed through executive orders, signed with a pen and enforced overnight. And two federal courts have already ruled that this use of IEEPA to impose tariffs is unlawful. The Court of International Trade declared these executive orders invalid as contrary to law. The Federal Circuit Court of Appeals agreed, and in November 2025, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments and appeared deeply skeptical of the administration's legal position. But despite these rulings, the tariffs remain in effect. The government appealed, and the enforcement was stayed pending the final Supreme Court decision. So right now, America exists in a kind of legal twilight zone. Billions of dollars are being collected under tariffs that two courts have already said should not exist. And nearly 2,000 importers have filed protective lawsuits, positioning themselves to demand refunds the moment the Supreme Court issues its verdict. But the economic fallout is not waiting for a court ruling. The ripple effects are already reshaping global alliances and trade routes in real time. Consider what happened with India. India had been one of the world's largest energy importers, sourcing crude from multiple global suppliers. In 2025, the White House decided to use tariffs to reshape where India buys its energy. A 25% secondary tariff was placed on Indian goods, on top of an existing 25% reciprocal levy. That meant Indian exports to America were suddenly facing a combined 50% tariff. The economic pressure was enormous, and in February 2026, India agreed to new terms. Prime Minister Modi committed to purchasing over $500 billion in American energy, technology, agricultural products, and coal. In return, the combined tariff rate was reduced to 18%. The White House called it a historic trade deal. But analysts called it something else entirely. Economic leverage on a scale not seen in modern history. And here is the detail that reveals the true scope of this strategy. The tariff on India was not really about trade deficits. It was about redirecting global energy flows to benefit American producers. By using tariffs as pressure, Washington effectively dictated where the world's fifth largest economy buys its fuel. India did not choose this position. It was simply caught in a web of great power competition and pressed to comply. This approach is now being replicated across the globe. The White House signed an executive order imposing tariffs on any country that purchases Venezuelan energy. It applied secondary tariffs on nations buying Iranian crude. It even imposed tariffs on Brazil over a diplomatic disagreement. Trade policy has become foreign policy, and foreign policy has become leverage. The line between economic partnership and economic pressure is disappearing fast. India was not the only focus. The North American Trading Partnership, once considered unshakable, has been thrown into uncertainty. Canada and Mexico, America's two largest trading partners, have faced 25% tariffs on nearly all goods since early 2025. The USMCA, the free trade agreement signed during the previous term, is now a stalled agreement. It has not been ended, but it has not been renewed either. It simply lingers, keeping businesses and governments guessing about what comes next. The White House has even questioned internally why it should not withdraw from the agreement entirely, and the pressure goes beyond trade. There have been repeated public statements about Canada becoming the 51st state. The stated approach would rely on economic leverage, not any other kind, to make it happen. In February 2026, there was a move to block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge, citing Canada's trade developments with China. Canadian officials have called these moves a direct challenge to their sovereignty. But the tariff system does not stop at North America. Steel and aluminum from every country on Earth now face 50% tariffs. Automobiles face 25% levies. Pharmaceuticals face tariffs as high as 100%. Semiconductors, copper, lumber, and critical minerals are all on the list. And here is what most people miss about tariffs. The foreign companies do not pay them. American importers pay them. And those costs get passed down the chain until they land directly on the American consumer. The Tax Foundation estimates the average effective tariff rate is now the highest since 1946. Every product on every shelf in every store across America carries an invisible tax that did not exist 2 years ago. But the administration argues this is all part of a grand strategy. The stated goal is to reshore manufacturing, reduce dependence on foreign supply chains, and bring critical industries back to American soil. And there is some logic to this argument. The United States has become dangerously dependent on China for critical minerals, rare earth elements, and semiconductor components. If a major geopolitical crisis erupted over Taiwan, entire sectors of the American economy could be frozen overnight. So the tariffs, in theory, create incentives for companies to move production back home. But theory and reality are two very different things. Building a semiconductor fabrication plant takes 5 to 7 years and costs upwards of $20 billion. Mining and refining rare earth elements requires infrastructure that simply does not exist in the United States today. And in the meantime, American businesses are under strain. The 3 largest automakers lobbied for exemptions, saying that tariffs would affect American companies more than foreign competitors. Small businesses that depend on imported materials have no lobbying power and no exemptions. They simply absorb the cost or close their doors. Meanwhile, Washington lobbyists are having the best year of their careers. The tariff system is so complex, so full of exemptions and carve-outs and technical language that only specialized firms in the Capitol can navigate it. Major publications have reported that the biggest beneficiary of this trade policy is the influence industry itself. Corporations with deep pockets can afford to hire these firms and secure exemptions. Family businesses, small retailers, and independent importers cannot. The tariff system has created a 2-tiered economy. Those who can afford to lobby Washington get relief. Those who cannot simply pay the tax and hope they survive. And the numbers tell a clear story. Car prices have risen by thousands of dollars. Grocery bills are climbing as agricultural tariffs ripple through the food supply chain. Electronics, clothing, building materials, even children's toys now cost more than they did 24 months ago. Inflation, which the Federal Reserve spent years bringing down, is being reignited by policy choices made in the Oval Office. Surveys show that 60% of Americans believe tariffs have caused consumer prices to rise. Consumer confidence fell sharply in early 2025 and has not recovered. And the political consequences are starting to show. The House of Representatives scheduled a vote in February 2026 to reject some of these tariffs. Even members of the president's own party are breaking ranks because midterm elections are approaching and voters are focused on the cost of living. Now, here's the part of this story that very few people are watching. While America raises its economic walls, China is building bridges. China has become what analysts now call the world's first electrostate. The defining technologies of the 21st century run on electrons. Electric vehicles, drones, automation systems, batteries, artificial intelligence. All of them require what is called the electric stack. And China has mastered every layer of it, from mining the lithium and cobalt to refining the materials, manufacturing the batteries, and exporting the finished products. China controls more of this supply chain than any country has ever controlled in any modern industry. China now produces more electric vehicles than the rest of the world combined. It manufactures over 80% of the world's solar panels. It dominates global battery production with over 75% market share, and it processes the vast majority of the rare earth minerals that every advanced economy depends on. While Washington asks countries to buy 20th century energy sources like oil, gas, and coal, Beijing is offering 21st century infrastructure at prices no one else can match. Chinese manufacturers benefit from massive government subsidies, cheap labor, and economies of scale that took 2 decades to build. The result is what Europeans call overcapacity and what developing nations call opportunity. Emerging markets across Africa, Asia, and Latin America are increasingly choosing Chinese technology over American products. Not because of ideology, but because of economics. A Chinese electric bus costs a fraction of an American equivalent. A Chinese solar installation can power a village at half the price, and this is creating a geopolitical turning point that most Americans are completely unaware of. A growing share of the world's energy, mobility, and industrial systems are being built on Chinese foundations. This gives Beijing commercial benefits and strategic influence that traditional diplomacy alone could never deliver. Every country that plugs into Chinese infrastructure becomes a long-term customer. Every power grid that runs on Chinese components creates a dependency. The artificial intelligence competition makes the stakes even higher. America may build the best AI models in the world, but AI does not run on ideas alone. It runs on energy, on data centers, on chips, and on the infrastructure to deploy it all. If China can power and deploy AI at scale using its dominant position in clean energy and manufacturing, it could lead the market even while trailing in the technology itself. And Europe is caught in the middle. In January 2026, the White House applied tariffs of up to 25% on goods from 8 European countries, unless they supported a proposed territorial acquisition. The move was retracted days later after a claimed framework deal with NATO's Secretary General. But the message was clear. European leaders now understand that alliance loyalty does not protect them from economic pressure. France, Germany, and the United Kingdom each entered 2026 with weak, unpopular governments facing populist movements on both the left and the right. Populist sentiment in Europe is rising, fueled partly by the very economic anxieties that American tariffs are intensifying. European leaders are struggling with a triple challenge. They must fill the security gap left by America's retreat from its traditional alliance role. They must manage rising defense commitments across the continent. And they must confront Chinese industrial overcapacity, flooding their markets with cheap electric vehicles, solar panels, and wind components. If Washington continues to treat Europe as a transactional partner rather than an ally, and if European leaders cannot rally their populations to increase defense spending, the post-war alliance framework could weaken in ways not seen since 1945. And then there is the resource competition that almost no one is discussing: fresh water. Half of humanity already lives under water stress. And this is not a problem for some distant future. It is happening right now. The Indus Waters Treaty between India and Pakistan has been suspended. Ethiopia's Grand Renaissance Dam on the Nile is now operational with no binding agreement with downstream nations. Egypt, which depends on the Nile for 90% of its fresh water, views this as an existential issue. China is building the world's largest dam with no downstream treaty in place. And here is what connects this to the tariff story. The technology economy runs on water. A single semiconductor fabrication plant uses millions of gallons of ultra-pure water every day. Data centers that power artificial intelligence require enormous cooling systems, and those systems require water. As the demand for chips and AI grows, the demand for water grows with it. New tensions over water rights are emerging in places no one expected, including the American Southwest, where tech companies are competing with farmers and cities for the same shrinking supply. There is no global architecture to manage water disputes. There are no tariffs that can solve a water shortage, and in 2026, that governance vacuum is getting deeper. So what happens next? The Supreme Court decision on IEEPA tariffs will be the most consequential trade ruling in a generation. If the court rules that the president cannot use emergency powers to impose tariffs without congressional approval, billions in refunds could flood the system. Companies that have already restructured their supply chains will not restructure them back. The disruption will have already taken its toll. But if the court upholds the president's authority, it will establish a precedent that any future president of any party can unilaterally reshape the global trading system using emergency declarations. That means every future trade relationship will be subject to the political decisions of whoever sits in the Oval Office. No treaty will be secure. No agreement will be permanent. And foreign governments will learn that deals made with Washington can be reversed overnight. The era of predictable, rules-based international trade would effectively be over, and the consequences would cascade far beyond America's borders. Countries like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan have already signed bilateral deals under enormous pressure. South Korea faced increased tariff threats when its legislature hesitated to ratify a trade agreement. Taiwan negotiated a deal in January 2026 that has still not been fully implemented. These are not negotiations between equals. They are ultimatums dressed in diplomatic language. Meanwhile, the BRICS nations are accelerating efforts to build alternative financial systems. If enough countries lose faith in the stability of dealing with Washington, they will look for other partners. And China is ready, offering infrastructure investment, technology transfer, and trade deals with fewer conditions attached. At least, that is how Beijing presents it. The reality is more complicated, but the perception matters. And perception is shifting faster than anyone in Washington wants to admit. The administration recently announced a $12 billion emergency stockpile for critical minerals. The goal is to reduce dependence on Chinese supply chains for the materials needed to build cars, phones, aircraft, and defense systems. Vice President Vance is leading a coalition of officials from Europe, Asia, and Africa to form what has been described as a global buyers club for critical minerals. This is the first serious attempt to build an alternative supply chain architecture, but it will take years to bear fruit. And in those years, China's lead in clean energy technology, battery manufacturing, and rare earth processing will only grow wider. Some analysts believe this is exactly the point. The old system benefited multinational corporations and financial elites, while hollowing out American manufacturing towns. Reshaping it was always going to be painful. The question is whether this shift leads to a stronger, more self-sufficient America, or to an isolated superpower watching the rest of the world reorganize without it. The next 12 months will decide. Alliances are shifting, supply chains are being rerouted, new economic blocs are forming, and the rules that governed global trade for 80 years are being rewritten in real time. The only question left is whether this leads to renewal or decline. History offers cautionary lessons. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930 were supposed to protect American industry. Instead, they triggered retaliatory tariffs around the world, collapsed international trade by 65%, and deepened the economic downturn of that era. The architects of those tariffs believed they were acting in America's interest. They were mistaken. That does not mean every tariff is a bad decision. Strategic trade policy can protect critical industries and national security. But there's a difference between a scalpel and a sledgehammer. And right now, the world is watching to see which one America is holding. The forces shaping the answer are moving faster than most people realize. To stay ahead of these global shifts and understand what they mean for your future, make sure you are following this channel. Because by the time this story reaches the mainstream, it will already be too late to prepare.